Greetings everyone and welcome to the first episode of Free For All. This is a new video series where I pit various different video games and anime against each other in order to see which are the best. With that said, for this first episode, I feel it's time I talked about a franchise that I have fallen in love with in such a short amount of time. No, not that one. Or that one. Yeah, that's more like it, the Castlevania series. Now the Castlevania series has been around since the early days of the NES and has grown into one of the most beloved video game franchises of all time. For the longest time, the series was simply a left-to-right action game that was ball-bustingly difficult. But ever since the PlayStation 1 era, the series went for a massive overhaul thanks to Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which changed the series into a MetroidVania-style action RPG, and ever since then, all 2D Castlevania games followed this format.
Before the dark times, before the Empire.
In particular, there were 3 Castlevania games on the DS that followed this Metroidvania style: Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow, Castlevania Portrait of Ruin, and Castlevania Order of Ecclesia. Each of these games are often regarded as some of the best games in the Castlevania series, and on the Nintendo DS. But which of them are the best? Well, that's what we're here to find out, as these games go head to head in order to see which of them comes out on top. How this is going to work is that I will be judging each of these games on 7 different categories: story and characters, gameplay and level design, graphics and art style, music, boss battles, difficulty, and finally, replay value. How the scoring system will work is that I will award first place in each category 3 points, second place 2 points, and third place only 1 point, and whoever has the most points at the end is the winner. For the record, each of these games are great in their own right, and if you're fans of the Metroidvania style action adventure games, then I recommend picking all of these games up. But you're not here to see all of these games come out on top, for there can only be one winner. And with that all cleared up, I must admit I did want to go into further detail about my history with Castlevania, but enough talk! How about you? Each of these games are unique in terms of story and characters, and they all have their own take on the Castlevania mythology. Dawn of Sorrow follows the events of Aria of Sorrow, as it takes place 1 year later. Soma and Mina are living peacefully together, with Soma believing that he has lost his dark powers until one day they are attacked by a woman named Celia Fortuna, and it is here where Soma's powers begin to resurface. After the encounter, Soma pursues Celia, as her goal is to resurrect the Dark Lord Dracula. But later we find out that her real goal is to destroy Soma so that her 2 other candidates, Dimitri and Dario, can become the Dark Lord himself. From then on out, Soma's journey follows his quest to defeat Celia and come to terms with himself as the new Count Dracula. Portrait of Ruin takes place during World War II and follows Jonathan Morris, the son of John Morris from Castlevania Bloodlines, and Charlotte Alluin, who are investigating Dracula's castle. Upon their arrival, they run into a ghost who turns out to be Eric Lecarde, yes, the very same one from Bloodlines. After travelling through one of the magical portraits, they run into one of the vampire sisters, and then eventually into the main antagonists of the game, Browner, and the sisters Stella and Loretta. And even though Browner has no intention of reviving Dracula, he is still a great threat, and thus has to be defeated. Later on, both Jonathan and Charlotte run into Death himself, whose goal is to bring back his master by destroying Browner. And from then on, the story follows Jonathan and Charlotte's battle against both Death and Browner, as well as Eric Lecarde's connection to the Vampire Sisters, and finally Jonathan's struggle to live up to the legacy of his father and be worthy of the Vampire Killer. Order of Ecclesia revolves around the organization of Ecclesia attempting to destroy Dracula for good, with our main character Shinoa being the bearer of Dracula's power and is the one who is destined to destroy him, until suddenly her brother Albus decides to steal the glyphs for himself, causing Shinoa to lose all her memories and emotions. Once she comes to relearn her abilities to absorb glyphs and use them from her master Barlow, she sets out in order to stop Albus and recover Dracula's power. Each of these games have strong stories and characters, but personally I think Dawn of Sorrow is the best. This is mainly due to the game continuing the story of Aria of Sorrow and being able to see all these old characters once again, as well as how they all get much more development and dialogue. I feel the game does a great job at showing Soma's struggle to fully understand that he is the new Dracula, as well as how he must be the one to use his power as he sees fit, as well as how it affects his relationship with his friends, in particular Julius and Mina. Order of Ecclesia comes in second for having a simple yet effective story and for the journey being a much more personal one for Shinoa, since along the way she rescues various different villagers and by helping them with their troubles, she slowly but surely starts to regain her emotions and become whole again. Not to mention, having to fight against her brother makes the confrontation much more personal. Portrait of Ruin comes in last since even though the story is good and it certainly feels the most in line with the Castlevania mythos, the characters aren't as strong as the other two games. Not to say I don't like the characters, since I think both Jonathan and especially Charlotte are great protagonists, and I really like Eric Lecard. Not to mention being able to see Death himself get some character development is pretty awesome. But overall, the characters and story just aren't as strong as the other two games, so the winner of this round is Dawn of Sorrow. Now each of these games follow the traditional MetroidVania style established in Castlevania Symphony of the Night, but with their own unique bells and whistles. Dawn of Sorrow follows the soul sealing mechanic used in Aria of Sorrow, which allows you to obtain the skills of the monsters you kill, and the level design is more focused on puzzle solving. Portrait of Ruin uses a unique dual character system, which allows you to switch between or use both Charlotte and Jonathan in order to focus on either physical or magical attacks, which allows for some very unique puzzle solving and boss fights, and the level design has a much larger focus on platforming and having a lot of variety to it thanks to the ability to travel to different locations for the use of portraits. Order of Ecclesia uses a glyph system similar to the soul system used in Aria of Sorrow, which allows you to absorb various different powers and abilities dropped from enemies and statues, and the level design has a much larger focus on combat and defeating enemies and obstacles, as well as travelling across various different environments. In terms of which is the best, I'm giving this one to Order of Ecclesia, mainly for the combat and the glyph system. The combat in Order of Ecclesia is so much better than the previous Castlevania games. It's just so much faster and more frantic than the other two games, and it makes the encounters with enemies much more thrilling and fast paced. The glyph system is very similar to the soul system in Aria of Sorrow, and all the different abilities you can unlock make the enemy encounters and boss fights all the more fun and challenging. Order of Ecclesia also has the best level design, as instead of being just in one giant castle, you're constantly moving from different locations, and the locations themselves are a nice mix of both Metroidvania style exploration as well as traditional Castlevania side-scrolling action. Portrait of Ruin comes in second for having a unique partner system, which helps to add some nice variety to the puzzle solving and enemy encounters, and especially some of the boss fights. Though admittedly, after a while Charlotte becomes so much better than using Jonathan, which can make using him rather pointless towards the end. And even though the level design starts out solid and has a good amount of variety, towards the end of the game starts reusing a lot of the same level design and it kind of feels like padding. Dawn of Sorrow comes in last because even though I like the soul system, the combat is really slow in this game, and until you find the souls you really like, the game can feel really slow and dull at times. Not to mention, it can be quite boring to fight certain enemies unless you have really good weapons or a really good soul. Also, even though the level design does its job well and some of the puzzle solving is really well done, not too much about the castle sticks out in my eyes, and some of the puzzle solving can be rather confusing, and others are just plain tedious. So the winner of this round is Order of Ecclesia, since I feel it incorporates the best elements of both games as well as offering its own unique experience. This was a rather tough one, since all of these games have very strong and distinctive art styles, as well as being some of the most graphically impressive games on the DS. But in this case, I'm giving it to Dawn of Sorrow, since it was the first of these games, and the jump in both sprite and background quality between this and Aria of Sorrow is just outstanding. Not to mention, the game has a much more anime look to it with the character portraits, and I think it works really well. I know some of people aren't fans of the new art style, but I think it works. Also, the game's atmosphere is just incredible. I mean, the castle's design and the overall look of the game, they just blend together so well, and the atmosphere it creates is just incredible. And because of this atmosphere, it makes it the most visually impressive of the three. Not to mention, it has that gorgeous anime intro. Order of Ecclesia comes in second since it has a more realistic look with the character portraits, which admittedly I wasn't a fan of at first, but it grew on me really quickly, and it fits the overall tone of the game because it's a much darker, much more serious Castlevania game. Also, because of how much variety there is in the level design, each environment is very distinctive and visually unique, since you're never in the same place twice and everything always looks different. Not to mention, Shinoa's sprite is just so beautifully animated, and the movement and actions in the game, as well as the visual effects, are incredible. Not to mention, a lot of enemy sprites are made specifically for this game, and the game really doesn't use much copying and pasting, which other Castlevania games are guilty of. Portrait of Ruin comes in last, since even though it still uses the anime style of Dawn of Sorrow and has a lot of really unique set pieces and very strong backgrounds, the game is guilty of copying and pasting a lot of enemy and boss sprites from other Castlevania games, and the game even copies and pastes environments towards the end of the game, only with slight changes in the colouring and time of day. So close call, but the winner of this round is Dawn of Sorrow. Oh man, this was a tricky one, since each of these games have fantastic soundtracks and they all fit the games perfectly, but if I have to pick a winner, it's going to be Order of Ecclesia. To me, Order of Ecclesia has the most catchy tunes that put me in the mood to kick some serious vampire ass, and in the end, the soundtrack is just the most memorable of the three. Not to mention, the game also has a nice mix of atmospherical music pieces, and the soundtrack as a whole just has so much variety and ambience to it, you can't help but love it. Portrait of Ruin comes in second, since even though a good chunk of the soundtrack is rather forgettable, the pieces that stand out really stand out and are some of the best pieces of music in the series. Tracks like Victorian Fear and The Gears Go Awry are such awesome songs, and I just love them. Dawn of Sorrow comes in last for having mostly atmospheric pieces that help to add to the game's overall atmosphere, but personally I prefer to listen to catchy tunes, which this game does have, just not as much as the other ones, though I'll give the game this: the remixes this game has of classic Castlevania tracks like Vampire Killer and Beginnings are really awesome. Again, all of these games have amazing soundtracks, and in the end, it's all down to personal preference, and for me, the winner of this round is Order of Ecclesia. Portrait of Ruin wins this round by storm. Seriously, the boss fights in Portrait of Ruin are just so awesome, and they are the best part of the game. True, the game does reuse bosses from Dawn of Sorrow, and some of the bosses aren't that great, in particular Astaire, since she makes Jonathan completely useless, and the fight against the vampire twins can be rather annoying, but the bosses as a whole are just great since they're very challenging, and some of them make great use out of the pair-up mechanic. Not to mention, the final boss in Portrait of Ruin is one of the best final bosses in any video game. I mean, you're fighting Death and Dracula in a team battle, and towards the end they fuse together. Christ, that's epic as fuck! Order of Ecclesia comes in second for having some very action-packed and unique boss fights that are challenging and a lot of fun, and thankfully aren't just repeats of previous bosses. However, some of the bosses in this game can be really annoying. I hate fighting the shadow monster in Dracula's castle because its attacks do so much fucking damage, and it's difficult to dodge this thing sometimes. And the fight against the giant enemy crab is just long and boring. Well, I guess after the Sony press conference, that crab had to find work somehow. Dawn of Sorrow comes in last for having some really good boss fights, but none of them stand out as being great or amazing. They just gotta get the job done. I mean, aside from the final boss, none of them are terrible, and they're not nearly as frustrating as the other two games, but they lack the wow factor the other game's bosses had. So the winner of this round is Portrait of Ruin. Okay, I'm just going to start by saying that Dawn of Sorrow wins this one for being the most well balanced out of the three in terms of difficulty. The game is challenging, but fair, and doesn't punish you too much for making mistakes. I mean, the game is certainly no cakewalk because it's a Castlevania game, they're not known for being easy. But this game knows just how hard each section of the game should be and never throws any curveballs at you. There's never a point in which I feel that the game is being unfair towards me or has a section of the game that's far too difficult to handle without the right ability. That's something I cannot say for Order of Ecclesia and Portrait of Ruin. In the case of Portrait of Ruin, the game is rather good difficulty-wise for the most part, but it has certain moments where the difficulty just jumps up in spades, and suddenly there is this one enemy or section of the game that beats the ever-loving shit out of you, and it will cause the game to come to a screeching halt until you beat it. Like trying to deal with the vampire sisters, who you must defeat in a certain way in order to get the true ending, and trying to do this is incredibly luck-based, trust me, as well as trying to tackle the game's gauntlet of enemies, which is downright impossible unless you spam the ultimate attacks or make sure Charlotte has some of the best magic spells in the game. In the case of Order of Ecclesia, this game is hard. I mean classic Castlevania hard. The enemies are strong, there are lots of them, unless you deal with them quickly, they're fucking relentless. Not to mention, getting good healing items in this game is considerably harder than it needs to be, and in certain cases, unless you have the right glyphs, you're not going to survive the later parts of the game. I'm serious when I say this game was classic Castlevania hard. But it's not just that, this game is Mega Man hard, it's BlazBlue Hazma hard, it's Monster Hunter G-Rank hard, it's Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn hard. Yes, Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn hard! In terms of which is the worst out of the two, funny enough, I find Portrait of Ruin to be the worst. I know Order of Ecclesia is the overall harder game, and it's probably the more frustrating of the two, but even though the game is hard, the difficulty is done in a way in which you still have a chance if you play your cards right, and the game rewards you for top-notch playing skills. If you know what glyphs to get and go out of your way to do the villager quests, the game becomes a lot more manageable. Portrait of Ruin, while easier overall, has those moments where the game just punches you in the throat and doesn't give you any chance to recover, and in my eyes, that's much worse, since even though Order of Ecclesia is harder in terms of difficulty, it's better designed and the game is hard, but fair, whereas Portrait of Ruin isn't fair hard, it's bullshit hard, and because of this, Portrait of Ruin is the worst out of the three in terms of difficulty. Each of these games has something to come back to after beating the main quest in order to get a more complete experience. Dawn of Sorrow has you collecting all the souls, which isn't necessary to beat the game like in Aria, but it is fun to mess around with all these abilities, and once you beat the game you can play through it as Julius Belmont alongside Yoko Belnades and Alucard himself for a much more straightforward experience. Portrait of Ruin has you completing all the missions that Eric Lecard sets you, as well as leveling up all your sub-weapons in order for them to become fully powered up, which can add a lot of hours onto each playthrough. Order of Ecclesia has you completing all the villager quests as well as being able to play as Albus once you beat the game, similar to Julius mode and Dawn of Sorrow. Overall, I think Order of Ecclesia has the best replay value, since even though I don't really care for Albus mode, since I prefer the more open-ended level design of Shinoa's campaign, the villager quests are expertly integrated into the game for both story and gameplay. Since by completing the villager quests, you get access to various different items and accessories that can be a major help when dealing with some of the more harder parts of the game. And they also help to show a more personal side of Shinoa's character, since by completing their missions, Shinoa learns more about the villagers, and it slowly but surely helps her to get her emotions back. Plus, even though the villagers aren't the most in-depth characters, they still offer up some interesting conversations and are nice characters in their own right, with my favourite being Laura, who I swear has the hots for Shinoa. Not that I blame her though. Dawn of Sorrow comes in second, since even though I'm not the biggest fan of Julius mode, it's still a fun option, and it's more suited to fans of the classic Castlevania games. And even though you don't have to get all the souls, I still recommend doing it since some of the souls can be a lot of fun to use, and it's always fun to see which soul suits you best. Portrait of Ruin comes in last, since even though the missions and leveling up weapons was a good idea, they are very poorly implemented, since the missions can give you some really good abilities and items, but completing them can be a bitch, since some of the tasks are just really tedious, and in some cases you need specific items for the mission, but if you just happen to throw away the item, or in my case, sell it for money, well tough shit, you can never get it back, and thus never complete all the missions. Also, leveling up the weapons really isn't worth it, because it takes so long to get them to reach their max level, which is the only time they actually change and get a power boost, and even then, the boost isn't even that strong, and because there are so many weapons to upgrade, it's really not worth it in the end. So the winner of the final round is Order of Ecclesia. In the end, Dawn of Sorrow is the most well-rounded, traditional, and straightforward of the games, offering up strong elements in just about everything and not having any major flaws. The game is the most accessible to play and does a great job of continuing what Aria of Sorrow started, and is probably the best one of the 3 Castlevania games to start with if you want to get into this series. Portrait of Ruin takes the foundations of the MetroidVania games and adds a lot of new elements to make it its own unique thing. Some of them work and some of them don't, and the game as a whole can be best described as being something that when it's good, it's really good, but when it's bad, it's painful. Out of the 3, it's the weakest overall, but it's still a great game in its own right. Order of Ecclesia very much takes the best bits of both games and implements them to make an overall very memorable and enjoyable experience. The glyph system, most diverse level design and much faster combat makes this the most fun game of the three to play, and pair that up with a strong story and characters, beautiful artwork and sprites, an absolutely amazing soundtrack, some epic boss fights and a very challenging but rewarding game, and the winner and overall best game of the three is Castlevania Order of Ecclesia. Thank you all for joining me on the first episode of 3FORALL. I have been Crash6500 and I'd like to know what you thought of the first episode, so please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I hope you all enjoyed the first episode of this series and hopefully you'll be excited to see even more 3FORALLs in the future. Until then, I wish you all a great night, take care, and as a special treat, the next video I will be doing will be a countdown. And before you even ask, yes, it's going to be Fire Emblem.